Some people change your life without you ever knowing their name. David Mitchell learned this truth on a Tuesday morning when five lawyers in $1,000 suits walked into Rosie's diner, their polished shoes clicking against the cracked linoleum like a countdown to everything he thought he knew about the woman in the corner booth. But that morning was still 8 months away. The alarm screamed at 3:47 a.m., same as every day. David's hand found the button in the dark, muscle memory guiding him through the motions of another pre-dawn rising. The apartment was cold. The heat had been shut off 3 days ago, but Emma didn't know that yet. He'd told her it was broken, that someone was coming to fix it soon. In the bathroom mirror, a 42-year-old man stared back with eyes that had seen too much and slept too little. Construction work had carved lines into his face before the accident took that life away. Now those same hands that once built foundations for million-dollar homes served coffee and flipped eggs for customers who barely looked up from their phones. The drive to Rosie's diner took 12 minutes through empty Boston streets. David had counted. 12 minutes of radio static and thoughts he couldn't afford to think. About Emma's latest report card, about the stack of medical bills growing like a tumor on his kitchen table, about the therapy sessions that cost more than he made in a week. Dyslexia, the doctors called it, like giving it a name made it easier to fix. Like knowing why Emma cried over homework every night somehow made the tears dry faster. The diner sat on Commonwealth Avenue like a relic from another era. All chrome and red vinyl and the kind of neon sign that flickered with each passing truck. Rick Castellano had owned it for 30 years, back when the neighborhood still had character instead of condos. Now the place hung on by habit and the loyalty of customers who remembered when coffee cost a quarter. David unlocked the back door and stepped into the familiar smell of yesterday's grease and industrial coffee. The prep work was meditative. Slice onions, prep bacon, check the coffee machines, fill the sugar dispensers, each task a small victory against the chaos waiting outside these walls. Nancy Chen arrived at 5:30, same as always. 55 years old and tough as the leather on her well-worn shoes, she'd been serving coffee since David was in high school. She raised 3 kids working double shifts, put them all through college, and never once complained about the customers who forgot to tip or the management that forgot to care. "Morning, sunshine," she said, tying her apron with practiced efficiency. "Emma's presentation today, right?" David nodded, grateful that someone remembered. Emma had been practicing her speech about butterflies for weeks, struggling with words that seemed to rearrange themselves on the page when she wasn't looking. "She'll do fine," Nancy added, reading his face. "That kid's got more fight in her than most adults I know." The first customers trickled in at 6, construction crews grabbing coffee and donuts, nurses ending their shifts at Mass General, early commuters who preferred the diner's honest mediocrity to Starbucks' expensive pretension. David moved through the routine, flipping eggs and buttering toast, his mind already calculating the day's small victories. $23 in tips might cover Emma's school lunch account for another week. She walked in at 7:15, not walked exactly, drifted, like she was apologizing for taking up space with each step. Mid-40s maybe, though it was hard to tell. Her clothes were expensive ones. You could see it in the cut of the wool coat, the quality of the leather boots, but time and circumstance had worn them to dignified weariness. Her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders, framing a face that carried the weight of unspoken sorrows. She chose the table by the window, the one with the cracked vinyl seat that nobody else wanted, sat with her back to the wall like she was expecting trouble to walk through the door. David had seen her type before. Divorce, probably. The kind where the lawyers got rich and everyone else got what was left. He'd watched proud women become invisible, their confidence dissolving with each court date until they moved through the world like ghosts of themselves. He walked over with a coffee pot and a menu, though she was already studying the laminated pages like they contained the secrets of the universe. "Coffee?" he asked. She looked up, startled. Her eyes were the deep green of old forests, and for a moment he saw something flicker there. Surprise, maybe, like she'd forgotten that people could see her. "Please," she said. Her voice was soft, educated, the kind that used to give orders to boardrooms and now asked for simple kindnesses. David poured the coffee and watched her wrap both hands around the mug, like it was the only warm thing in her world. Maybe it was. "You need a few minutes to decide?" he asked. "Toast," she said quickly. Just, just toast would be fine. Wheat or white, whatever's easier." David nodded and turned to go, then stopped. Something in her voice, in the way she held herself so carefully together, made him pause. "You know what?" he said. "Our cook makes a mean stack of pancakes on the house for first-time customers." The woman, he still didn't know her name, stared at him like he'd just offered her the moon. "That's very kind," she said. "But I couldn't—" "Already writing it up," David lied, tapping his order pad. "Rick's rules, not mine." When he brought the pancakes 10 minutes later, she was writing in a small leather journal, her handwriting precise and careful. She looked up as he set the plate down, and for the first time, she almost smiled. "Thank you," she said. "I'm Victoria." "David," he replied. "Welcome to the neighborhood." She ate slowly, like each bite was a small ceremony. When she finished, she left a $20 bill on a $12 check and walked out before David could bring her change. Nancy sidled up to the register, watching Victoria's retreat through the window. "Interesting," she said. "How so?" "That coat she's wearing? That's Burberry. Real stuff, not knockoff. And those boots are Italian leather. Either she's new money trying to look poor, or old money that's hit some trouble." David wiped down the counter, processing this information. "Maybe she's just having a hard time." "Maybe," Nancy agreed. "Or maybe she's got secrets." Victoria came back the next morning. Same time, same table, same careful distance from the world around her. This time she ordered eggs and toast, paid with exact change, and lingered over her coffee like it was the only appointment on her calendar. David found himself watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. The way she held her pen when she wrote. The way she startled when the espresso machine hissed too loud. The way she seemed to disappear into herself whenever other customers got too close. On the third day, she was waiting when he opened. "Early bird today," David said, unlocking the door. "I hope you don't mind," Victoria said. "I like the quiet." She settled into her spot while David went through his opening routine. Nancy wouldn't arrive for another hour, which meant it was just the two of them and the sound of coffee brewing and morning traffic beginning to build outside. "You know," David said, bringing her coffee without being asked, "I've been coming here 3 years, and you're the first person who's ever beaten me in." Victoria smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "I'm not much of a sleeper. Bad dreams? Bad memories are," she corrected. "Dreams require rest." David nodded, understanding more than she might expect. "Kids have a way of keeping you up at night." "You have children?" "A daughter, Emma. She's 8. Victoria's expression shifted, something vulnerable flickering across her features. 8 is a wonderful age. "Most days," David agreed. "Other days she's doing homework and crying because the letters won't stay still on the page. And I'm trying to figure out how to explain dyslexia to a kid who just wants to read like her friends." The words came out before he could stop them. David didn't usually share personal details with customers, but something about Victoria's careful attention made him feel heard in a way he'd almost forgotten. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "You don't need to hear about my problems." "Actually," Victoria said softly, "I think I do." They talked for 20 minutes while David prepped for the morning rush. About Emma's struggles with reading, about the specialists who cost more than David made in a month, about the feeling of watching your child fight battles you couldn't win for them. Victoria listened like she was memorizing every word. When Nancy arrived and the breakfast crowd began filtering in, Victoria quietly paid her check and left. But as David cleared her table, he found something she'd forgotten. A business card, cream-colored and expensive, with just a name and phone number. Victoria Sterling, CEO, Sterling Educational Solutions. David stared at the card for a long moment, then slipped it into his apron pocket. He'd return it tomorrow. Ask her about the company, maybe. See if that careful sadness in her jade eyes had anything to do with educational solutions and 8-year-old girls who couldn't make letters behave. But when tomorrow came, Victoria's table sat empty. One day became two. Two became a week. David found himself glancing toward the window every time the bell chimed, looking for a woman who seemed to have vanished as quietly as she'd appeared. Maybe she found a better place, Nancy suggested, watching David wipe down the unused table for the third time. Maybe, David said, but he kept making coffee for the window table anyway, just in case. 2 weeks into Victoria's absence, David's phone rang at 2 a.m., Massachusetts General Hospital. Emma had woken up screaming about stomach pain that felt like fire eating her from the inside. Appendicitis. Emergency surgery. Sign here, we need to operate now. Your insurance will cover 60%. 40% of $15,000. $6,000 David didn't have, would never have, couldn't even imagine having. He sat in the surgical waiting room calculating impossible math while his 8-year-old daughter fought for her life 3 floors above. $6,000 might as well have been $6 million for all the chance he had of raising it. The surgery went perfectly. Emma would be fine, fully recovered within weeks. The financial recovery would take considerably longer. Mr. Mitchell, a woman in scrubs approached his chair. There's been an anonymous donation to cover your daughter's remaining medical expenses. The full amount. David stared at her like she was speaking a different language. Anonymous? The donor requested complete confidentiality, but your bill has been paid in full. That night, David sat beside Emma's hospital bed, watching her sleep peacefully for the first time in days, and thought about Victoria's business card, still tucked in his wallet, about educational solutions and green eyes that had seen too much sorrow, about the kind of person who left $20 tips on $12 checks. Victoria returned on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after disappearing with no explanation. David was refilling salt shakers when she slipped into her usual spot like she'd never been gone. Same careful posture, same expensive clothes worn to respectable weariness, same forest green eyes that seemed to hold more stories than one lifetime should contain. David set down the salt and approached her table. The thank you speech he'd rehearsed for days suddenly inadequate. Victoria, he said. David. She looked up from the menu she wasn't really reading. How is Emma? The question hit him like cold water. She knew. Of course she knew. Better. Much better. The surgery went perfectly. He paused, gathering courage. Someone paid the medical bills. Anonymously. I'm glad, Victoria said, her voice carefully neutral. Children shouldn't have to suffer because their parents can't afford help. It was you. It wasn't a question. Victoria met his gaze steadily, neither confirming nor denying. Coffee? She asked. The morning routine resumed as if the 3-week gap had never existed. Victoria wrote in her journal while David served the breakfast rush. Nancy delivered plates with her usual efficiency, shooting curious glances toward the window table whenever she thought no one was looking. But something had shifted. Where before Victoria had seemed like a woman hiding from the world, now she appeared to be hiding from herself. She startled at sudden noises, checking the door each time the bell chimed. Her hands shook slightly when she reached for her coffee cup. You okay? David asked during a lull between customers. Victoria set down her pen and looked at him with those jade eyes. Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? Every day, David said honestly. Used to build houses, good ones. Had my own crew, my own reputation. Then I fell off a roof, busted up my back, lost the business, lost the insurance, lost everything except Emma. Do you miss it? The person you used to be? David considered this, wiping his hands on his apron. Sometimes, but that guy never would have ended up here. Never would have met Emma's reading teacher, or you, or half the people who've made this life worth living. Maybe losing everything was the only way to find what mattered. Victoria nodded like she understood something essential. I had a daughter once, she said quietly. The words hung between them like a bridge David wasn't sure he was meant to cross. Had? Sophie. Victoria's voice caught on the name. She would have been 9 this year. Would have been Emma's age when... She didn't finish. Didn't need to. I'm sorry, David said, and meant it in a way that reached bone deep. Car accident. 2 years ago, I was driving. Victoria stared at her hand, still trembling slightly. Everyone said it wasn't my fault. Black ice, terrible visibility, could have happened to anyone. But Sophie still died, and I was still the one behind the wheel. David understood now. The careful way Victoria held herself, the expensive clothes worn like penance, the anonymous donation that had appeared like grace. Is that why you disappeared? The guilt? Partly. Victoria looked toward the window, watching morning commuters rush past with their purpose and their certainty. My husband, ex-husband, he blamed me, not in words but in the space between words, in the way he looked at me after the funeral like I was a stranger who'd stolen his real wife. She paused, gathering strength for what came next. I used to run a company, educational software for children with learning disabilities. Built it from nothing after Sophie was diagnosed with autism. We were going to change how kids like her learn, give them tools to succeed in a world that wasn't designed for different minds. Sterling Educational Solutions, David said. Victoria looked surprised. You know it? Your business card. You left it here weeks ago. Right. She touched her temple like trying to hold scattered thoughts in place. After Sophie died, I couldn't sit in boardrooms making decisions about children's education when I couldn't even keep my own child safe. So I walked away, left the company to my partners, and tried to figure out how to be human again. David refilled her coffee cup, giving her time to continue or not. I've been living in motels, Victoria said finally. Different name each week, paying cash, trying to understand who I am when I'm not Victoria Sterling, CEO. When I'm just a woman who failed at the most important job she'll ever have. You didn't fail, David said firmly. You loved her. That's not failure. Isn't it? Victoria's laugh was bitter as black coffee. I built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars helping other people's children learn, but I couldn't protect my own daughter from a patch of ice on a February morning. The breakfast rush was picking up, but David couldn't bring himself to move away from this conversation. Sometimes someone's truth demands witnesses, even in a room full of people ordering eggs and bacon. How did you end up here, he asked. Random chance. I was driving around looking for somewhere anonymous to disappear, and your sign was the only one still lit at 2 a.m. Victoria smiled sadly. Seemed like fate somehow. A place for people who needed to be invisible. And the money you gave me for Emma's surgery? Sophie's trust fund. She won't need it now. Victoria's voice was steady, but David could see the cost of that steadiness. I've been looking for ways to honor her memory. When you told me about Emma's dyslexia, it felt like maybe Sophie was telling me something. Nancy appeared at David's elbow, coffee pot in hand and concern written across her weathered features. Sorry to interrupt, she said, but we've got customers backing up. David nodded, torn between duty and the feeling that Victoria was finally ready to share the weight she'd been carrying alone. Go, Victoria said, understanding. I'll be here. The morning rush demanded David's attention, but he found himself glancing toward the window table whenever possible. Victoria sat writing in her journal, occasionally pausing to stare outside with an expression David couldn't quite read. When the last customer left and the diner settled into its mid-morning quiet, David approached with fresh coffee. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Victoria looked up expectantly. "Why here? Why stay in a place like this when you could go anywhere?" Victoria considered the question while David wiped down the neighboring table. "You know what the hardest part is about losing everything that defined you?" she said finally. "It's discovering that most people only saw the definition, not the person underneath. My friends, my colleagues, even my family. They knew Victoria Sterling, CEO. They have no idea how to talk to Victoria, the grieving mother." She gestured around the diner's worn interior. "But here, I'm just another customer with too much sadness and not enough purpose. You don't care about my company or my stock portfolio or my degrees from Harvard. You just see someone who needs warmth and human decency. Is that enough?" "For now." Victoria closed her journal and looked directly at David. "What about you? Is this enough? The early mornings and the difficult customers and the tips that barely cover Emma's expenses?" David thought about the question while restocking napkin dispensers. "It's honest work, and it gives me time with Emma. But you're right, it's not what I planned." "What did you plan?" "My own restaurant eventually. Something small, family-owned. The kind of place where you know your customers' names and their usual orders and their kids' birthdays." David laughed self-consciously. "Sounds naive when you say it out loud." "It sounds wonderful," Victoria said sincerely. "What's stopping you?" "Money, experience, time, the usual suspects." "What if those weren't obstacles?" David paused in his napkin restocking. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if you had the capital to start small? A food truck maybe, or catering business. Something you could build while still working here, still being present for Emma?" "Victoria, if you're thinking about giving me more money—" "I'm thinking about investing in potential," she interrupted. "There's a difference." Before David could respond, the bell above the door chimed, and a man in an expensive suit walked in. He was younger than David, with the kind of confident stride that came from never having to check his bank balance before ordering coffee. The man scanned the room, his gaze settling on Victoria with obvious recognition and barely concealed frustration. "There you are," he said, approaching their table with the familiarity of someone who expected to be welcomed. "Do you have any idea how worried everyone's been?" Victoria's face went pale, her emerald gaze darting between the man and the exit like a trapped animal calculating escape routes. "James, how did you find me?" "Credit card records. Your therapist. Private investigator." James glanced dismissively at David before focusing back on Victoria with laser intensity. "This has gone on long enough, Vic. The board is asking questions. Investors are getting nervous. You can't just disappear because you're having difficulty processing your grief." "I'm not processing grief," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying an edge David had never heard before. "I'm drowning in it." "There's a difference?" The question hung in the air like accusation. David felt like an intruder in this moment, but Victoria's obvious distress kept him rooted in place. "Yes," Victoria said with sudden fire. "Processing suggests an endpoint. Drowning suggests I'm still fighting to breathe." James sighed with practiced patience. "Look, I understand you're struggling, but running away isn't the solution. Come back to Boston, resume your position, channel this pain into something productive." "Like you did?" Victoria's voice could have cut glass. James's expression hardened. "That's not fair, isn't it? You moved on awfully quickly, James. New penthouse, new girlfriend, new life without any inconvenient reminders of what we lost." David understood now. This wasn't just Victoria's business partner. This was her ex-husband, the man who'd blamed her for their daughter's death. "I'm trying to rebuild," James said. "You're trying to disappear." "Maybe disappearing is rebuilding." Victoria replied, standing with sudden dignity. Maybe starting over means leaving behind the person who failed at everything that mattered. James looked around the diner with obvious distaste, his designer shoes clicking against the worn linoleum. This isn't starting over, Vic. This is giving up. No, Victoria said, her voice gaining strength. Giving up would have been easier. She walked toward the door without looking back. James followed, still talking, still trying to convince her to return to a life she'd already left behind. David watched them through the window as they stood beside a black Mercedes, voices raised in an argument he couldn't hear, but could feel in the tension of their postures. Victoria gestured toward the diner, toward David watching from inside. James grabbed her arm, not violently but possessively. Victoria pulled away sharply, said something that made James step back like he'd been slapped, then walked away down Commonwealth Avenue on foot. James stood by his Mercedes for a long moment, staring after her, before getting in and driving away in the opposite direction. Victoria never came back inside. 3 days passed with no sign of Victoria. David found himself making coffee for the empty window table each morning, a ritual that felt more like prayer than habit. Nancy stopped commenting on the wasted coffee after the first day, recognizing something in David's expression that didn't invite discussion. On Thursday morning, Rick approached the coffee station where David was mechanically wiping down already clean surfaces. Listen, Rick said, his voice carrying the weight of a conversation he'd been avoiding. I got some news yesterday that affects all of us. David looked up from his unnecessarily thorough cleaning. Bank's calling in the loan, Rick continued. 30 days to pay up or they take the place. The words hit David like cold water. Rosie's diner had been struggling for years, but it was the kind of slow decline that felt manageable until suddenly it wasn't. How much, David asked, though he suspected the answer would be devastating. 200,000. Might as well be 2 million for all the chance I have of raising it. Nancy appeared from the storage room carrying a case of coffee filters, her usual efficiency faltering when she saw their faces. What's wrong? Rick repeated the news while Nancy set down the filters with careful precision, her hands steadying themselves on the counter. 30 days, she said, like testing the weight of the words. 30 days, Rick confirmed, his voice heavy with defeat. David thought about Emma's school across town, about the morning routine that anchored their shared life, about the customers who become something like family over the past 3 years. What about the loyal customers? The history of this place? David asked desperately. Bank doesn't care about loyalty, Rick said bitterly. They see prime real estate in a neighborhood that's getting gentrified whether we like it or not. Probably tear this place down and put up another Starbucks or luxury condos. The breakfast rush felt different that morning, weighted with the knowledge that each order might be bringing them closer to the end. David moved through the motions. Eggs over easy, wheat toast, coffee black, while his mind calculated impossible mathematics. His savings, Nancy's nest egg, whatever they could scrape together wouldn't make a dent in $200,000. During the afternoon lull, David found himself staring at Victoria's business card, still tucked in his wallet, Sterling Educational Solutions. He pulled out his phone, and before he could second-guess himself, dialed the number. Sterling Educational Solutions. This is Jennifer. I'm looking for Victoria Sterling, David said. I'm sorry, Ms. Sterling is no longer with the company. Can I direct you to someone else? Do you have any way to reach her? It's important. I'm afraid I can't give out personal information. Is this regarding business with Sterling Educational? David hung up, frustrated and more worried than before. Victoria had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. On Friday afternoon, as David was preparing to look up after his shift, a black sedan pulled up outside the diner. Not James's Mercedes, but something similar. Expensive, out of place. A woman in her 60s stepped out, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing the kind of clothes that suggested both wealth and authority. She walked into the diner with purpose, scanning the room until her gaze settled on David. "Are you David Mitchell?" she asked. David nodded, his heart beginning to pound with familiar dread. People like this didn't walk into places like Rosie's Diner unless something was very wrong. "My name is Margaret Walsh. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Victoria Sterling." The words hit David like a physical blow. The coffee pot slipped from his hand, shattering on the tile floor in an explosion of glass and dark liquid. "Estate?" David's voice came out as a whisper. "I'm very sorry to inform you that Miss Sterling passed away peacefully yesterday evening at Massachusetts General Hospital," Margaret said with practiced gentleness. "Heart failure. She'd been dealing with the condition for several months, though she told very few people." The diner went completely quiet. Even the espresso machine seemed to hum softer, as if the news had changed the air pressure in the room. David felt his legs give out. He sank onto a nearby stool, staring at Margaret Walsh like she was speaking a language he'd forgotten how to understand. Nancy rushed over with a towel to clean up the broken coffee pot, her movements sharp with sudden grief for a woman she'd barely known, but had watched David care about. "She left very specific instructions regarding you and this establishment," Margaret continued gently. "Is there somewhere private we could speak?" In Rick's cramped office, surrounded by file cabinets and the smell of old coffee, Margaret opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "Before we discuss Miss Sterling's bequest," she said, "there are some things you need to understand about who Victoria Sterling really was." David looked up from the hands he'd been staring at, trying to process the reality that Victoria was gone. "Victoria wasn't just wealthy, Mr. Mitchell. She was one of the most successful education entrepreneurs in the country. Sterling Educational Solutions was valued at over $1 billion when she stepped down 18 months ago." The number hit David like a physical blow. $1 billion. That's not possible," he said. "She was living in motels, wearing clothes that were falling apart. She ordered toast because it was cheap. She was living in motels because she'd sold her penthouse and donated the proceeds to children's charities," Margaret corrected gently. "She was wearing old clothes because she'd given away her entire wardrobe to women's shelters, and she ordered toast because food had lost its meaning for her after losing her daughter." Margaret pulled out a sealed envelope with David's name written in Victoria's careful script. "She wanted you to read this before we discuss the financial arrangements." David's hands shook as he opened the envelope. Inside were 5 pages covered in Victoria's handwriting, words that seemed to blur as he tried to focus on them. "Dear David, if you're reading this, then my heart has finally given out, and Dr. Morrison's predictions have proved accurate. Please don't be sad. I've been living on borrowed time since the night Sophie died, and these past 8 months at the diner have been the first time since the accident that I've felt truly alive. You're probably wondering why I never told you who I really was. The truth is, I'd forgotten. For 18 months after Sophie's death, I was nothing but grief wearing expensive clothes. I'd lost not just my daughter, but any sense of who I was beyond being her mother. When I walked into Rosie's Diner that first morning, I was planning to disappear permanently. I'd written letters to my lawyers, arranged for the distribution of my assets, said goodbye to what little family remained. I was tired, David. Tired of carrying guilt that felt heavier than my own bones. But then you brought me coffee. Not because I could pay for it. I know you subsidize my meals more often than not, but because you saw someone who needed warmth and human decency. You talked to me like I was worth talking to. You shared Emma's struggles and let me be part of her victories. For 8 months, I wasn't Victoria Sterling, CEO. I was just Victoria, the sad woman at the window table who'd found people worth caring about again. Emma reminds me so much of Sophie. Same age, same bright curiosity, same frustration with a world that wasn't designed for minds like theirs. When you told me about her reading struggles, I knew Sophie was sending me a message. that maybe losing her didn't have to mean losing purpose. I've arranged for several gifts, which Ms. Walsh will explain. But the most important thing I'm leaving you isn't money, it's responsibility. There are thousands of children like Emma and Sophie who need advocates, who need places where their differences are seen as strengths rather than deficits. I'm trusting you to carry that forward, not because you're perfect, but because you're good. Because you see people who've been made invisible by circumstance or society. Because you understand that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply show up with simple grace and genuine kindness. The foundation I'm establishing in Sophie's name will need someone who understands what families are really struggling with. Someone who's navigated the system, fought the battles, celebrated the small victories. I can't think of anyone better suited for that role than you. Thank you for giving me 8 months of purpose. Thank you for letting me be Emma's friend. Thank you for proving that there are still people in this world who lead with their hearts. With love and gratitude, Victoria P.S. The restaurant dream isn't dead, David. It's just getting started. David read the letter twice before he could see clearly enough to look up at Margaret. She left instructions for several primary bequests, Margaret said. First, $1 million for Emma's education and future needs, to be held in trust until she reaches 18. David's breath caught. Second, she's established a fund to purchase Rosie's Diner outright and renovate it as a community learning center while maintaining its function as a neighborhood gathering place. The total allocation for this project is $500,000. She saved the diner? Third, and most significantly, she's established the Sophie Victoria Foundation with an endowment of $100 million. The foundation will provide educational support for children with learning differences, fund research into innovative teaching methods, and create community programs that help families navigate the challenges of raising children with special needs. Margaret paused, watching David's reaction. She's named you as the executive director, Mr. Mitchell. The position comes with a salary of $150,000 annually, plus benefits and a housing allowance. David stared at Margaret like she'd just announced that gravity had been reversed. I can't, I'm not qualified to run a foundation. According to Victoria, your qualifications are exactly what the position requires. You're a parent who's navigated the system, you understand what families are really struggling with, and you have a gift for seeing people who've been overlooked. Margaret reached into her briefcase again and withdrew a final document. There's one more thing. Victoria arranged for the diner to be renamed Sophie's Place and completely renovated to include a learning center where parents and children can access resources, tutoring, and support groups while still maintaining the diner's essential character as a community gathering place. Sophie's Place, David whispered, the name feeling both foreign and inevitable on his tongue. Sophie's Place, Margaret confirmed. She also left specific bequests for your colleagues. An hour later, David sat in the diner's main dining room with Nancy and Rick, all three of them holding envelopes and wearing expressions of disbelief. Nancy's letter was brief but generous. $100,000 in recognition of her years of service and dedication, plus the offer to manage Sophie's Place with a substantial salary increase and full benefits. Rick's letter was longer, acknowledging his role in creating a space where people felt welcomed, regardless of their circumstances. Victoria had left him $200,000 in the position of general manager, allowing him to keep the diner running while David focused on foundation work. She was watching us, Nancy said, wiping her eyes with her apron. All those mornings, sitting at that table, she was paying attention to who we really were. She saw what this place really meant to people, Rick added, what it could become. David looked around the diner, at the cracked vinyl booths that would soon be repaired, at the faded walls that would soon display children's artwork, at the window table where Victoria had sat writing in her journal and planning their futures. What do we do now? Nancy asked. David thought about Emma, about the therapy sessions that had already helped her read with confidence, about the thousands of other children struggling with learning differences, and the families trying to navigate systems that didn't understand their needs, about Victoria's final gift of purpose wrapped in possibility. Now we build something worthy of her trust, David said. We create the kind of place Sophie would have loved to visit, where every child matters, every family belongs, and kindness is the most important item on the menu. The renovation took 4 months. David worked closely with architects to preserve the diner's essential character while adding the learning center that would serve the community. The window table where Victoria used to sit became a memorial corner with comfortable reading chairs and bookshelves filled with educational resources. The Sophie Victoria Foundation launched with programs in 15 school districts across Massachusetts. Support groups for parents, specialized tutoring for children with learning differences, teacher training workshops, and advocacy services for families navigating special education systems. Emma became one of the foundation's first success stories. Her reading had improved dramatically with continued therapy, and she developed a passion for helping other children who struggled with similar challenges. 6 months after Victoria's death, David stood in the doorway of Sophie's place during the grand reopening celebration. The diner was packed with families from the community, children working on homework in the learning center, parents sharing resources and support over coffee. Nancy moved between tables with her usual efficiency, but now she wore a name tag that read manager and a smile that seemed permanently fixed. Rick had embraced his role as community coordinator, organizing family events and making sure every visitor felt welcome. The foundation work had challenged David in ways he'd never expected. Learning about educational policy, visiting schools, meeting with families who were fighting the same battles he'd fought for Emma. But Victoria had been right. His qualifications weren't academic. They were deeply human. Every morning, David still made coffee for the window table where Victoria used to sit. Not because he expected her to return, but because some rituals are about remembrance rather than habit. The memorial corner had become a gathering place for quiet reflection, where parents could find peace while their children explored the learning resources. Today was different, though. Today marked 1 year since Victoria's death and the anniversary of Emma's reading breakthrough. To celebrate, Emma had asked to visit Victoria's grave and read aloud from the journal Victoria had left behind. They drove to Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, where Victoria was buried beneath a simple headstone that read, Victoria Sterling, beloved mother to Sophie, friend to all who needed one. Emma carried a thermos of coffee and a plate of toast cut into small pieces, the meal Victoria had ordered on her first morning at the diner. Is she really here? Emma asked as they approached the grave. Her body is here, David said carefully. But I think the part of her that mattered most is everywhere she made a difference. In the foundation that helps other kids like you. In Sophie's place where families find support. In the way we remember to be kind to people who seem invisible. Emma knelt and placed the coffee and toast beside the headstone, then opened Victoria's journal to a page they'd marked together. Dear Sophie, Emma read aloud, her voice clear and confident. Today I met a little girl who reminds me of you. She struggles with reading the same way you struggled with numbers, but she has the same bright spirit and brave heart. I think you would be friends. David listened to his daughter read words that had once seemed impossible, words written by a woman who'd turned grief into purpose and loneliness into love. I miss you every day, Emma continued, but I'm learning that missing someone can be a form of loving them too. Every child I help learn to read is a letter I'm writing to you. Every family that finds hope is a way of keeping your memory alive. Emma looked up at David. Should I read more? Just a little more, David said, thinking about the drive back to Sophie's place, where afternoon tutoring sessions would begin soon. I used to think losing you meant losing everything, Emma read, but I've learned that love doesn't end with death. It just changes form. The love I have for you has become love for every child who needs an advocate, every parent who feels lost, Every person who's been made to feel invisible by circumstances beyond their control. Emma closed the journal and stood, brushing dirt from her knees. I think she's proud of us, Emma said with the matter-of-fact certainty of 8-year-olds. I think you're right, David replied. They walked back through the cemetery together, past headstones marking lives lived and legacies left, past oak trees that had witnessed decades of grief and healing. Behind them, coffee sat steaming in the autumn air, and toast waited to nourish whatever creatures called the cemetery home. At Sophie's place, the afternoon rush was beginning. Families arriving for tutoring sessions, children settling into reading corners, parents finding community with others who understood their challenges. David tied on his apron and surveyed the scene. Nancy serving coffee to a mother whose son was struggling with dyslexia, Rick showing a new family around the learning center, Emma helping a kindergartner practice letter sounds. This was Victoria's true inheritance. Not the money, though, that had made everything possible, but the reminder that human compassion is the most powerful force in the world. That seeing people who've been made invisible can literally save lives. That love, properly directed, can transform grief into hope and despair into purpose. The door chimed as new customers entered, and David moved toward them with coffee and menus, and the understanding that every person who walked through that door carried stories that mattered, dreams that deserved nurturing, and hearts that needed the simple grace of being truly seen. In the corner booth by the window, a fresh cup of coffee sat waiting, not for a ghost but as a promise, a reminder that some tables are set not for those who will return, but for those who taught us how to keep serving others long after they've gone. Above the memorial corner, a simple plaque bore Victoria's words. The most important thing we can do is simply show up with coffee and kindness. And every day, that's exactly what they did.